The Silver Pine Wildlife Sanctuary stood on the edge of a remote mountain town, far from bustling highways and urban distractions. Once a thriving haven for injured and abandoned animals, the sanctuary had become a shell of its former self over the years. Funding had dried up as public interest waned. The peeling paint on the buildings and the overgrown pathways told the story of years of neglect. The main gate hung on a single rusted hinge, creaking with every gust of wind, a haunting reminder of the sanctuary's better days. For the few who still visited, the sanctuary carried an air of bittersweet resilience. The animals that lived there had been rescued from heartbreaking circumstances, some injured in the wild, others victims of human cruelty. Their enclosures were modest but clean, thanks to the tireless work of volunteers. Among these residents was Kodiak, a 12-year-old grizzly bear who had once been the sanctuary's pride and joy. Kodiak was massive, even for a grizzly. His hulking frame and thick, grizzled fur gave him an air of majesty, but his eyes told a different story. They were heavy with sadness, reflecting years of pain and struggle. 12 years earlier, he had been rescued from a poacher's trap deep in the Alaskan wilderness. The steel jaws of the trap had crushed his left hind leg, leaving him permanently disabled. Though the sanctuary staff had done their best to treat his wounds, the injury never fully healed. Chronic infections plagued him, and his mobility was limited. In his prime, Kodiak had been a symbol of resilience. Visitors would stand in awe as he lumbered across his enclosure. But now, his movements were slow and labored. He spent most of his days lying in the shade of a lone tree, his once thunderous growls reduced to soft grunts of discomfort. The staff, though devoted, were stretched thin. Resources were scarce, and specialized medical care for an animal of Kodiak's size and condition was a luxury they simply couldn't afford. The sanctuary's director, a pragmatic but kind-hearted woman named Ruth, often lingered by Kodiak's enclosure. She would watch him with a heavy heart, knowing they were running out of options. The sanctuary's finances were precarious, and with Kodiak's health deteriorating, tough decisions had to be made. For Kodiak, the world had shrunk to the confines of his enclosure. The sounds of the forest beyond the sanctuary, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, were reminders of a life he could never return to. Despite his pain, there was a quiet dignity about him. Even in his suffering, he remained a powerful presence, commanding respect and admiration from all who met him. The sanctuary's plight mirrored Kodiak's own struggle. Both were fighting against time, trying to hold on in a world that seemed to have forgotten them. Ella Parker was 16 years old and already knew what she wanted to do with her life. She dreamed of becoming a veterinarian, dedicating herself to helping animals in need. Her love for animals was more than just a hobby, it was her calling, forged in the crucible of her own childhood trauma. When Ella was 8, she had been in a car accident that left her physically unharmed but emotionally scarred. For months, she struggled with nightmares and crippling anxiety, withdrawing from friends and family. It was a therapy dog named Max, a golden retriever with a gentle spirit, who finally helped her heal. Max's unconditional love and patience had drawn Ella out of her shell, teaching her to trust the world again. From that moment on, she vowed to dedicate her life to animals, just as Max had saved her. Ella's passion for animals led her to volunteer at the Silver Pine Wildlife Sanctuary. She started coming after school and on weekends, helping with everything from cleaning enclosures to feeding the animals. Over time, she became a familiar face around the sanctuary, earning the trust and admiration of the staff. Despite her young age, Ella was fiercely determined and had a maturity beyond her years. She wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty, whether it meant scrubbing cages or tending to sick animals. Her favorite moments were the quiet ones, sitting by the enclosures, observing the animals, and sketching them in her notebook. She had a particular affinity for Kodiak, the sanctuary's aging grizzly. Ella was drawn to Kodiak not just because of his impressive size but because she saw a kindred spirit in him. Like her, he had been through trauma and come out the other side, albeit with scars. She often sat by his enclosure, reading aloud or simply talking to him as if he could understand her. "Hey, big guy," she'd say, her voice soft and soothing. "I brought you an apple today. It's your favorite, right?" Kodiak would lift his massive head and look at her with those deep, soulful eyes. He never made a sound, but Ella liked to imagine that he understood her in some way. She felt a connection to him that she couldn't explain, as if they shared an unspoken bond. Ella's dedication didn't go unnoticed. Ruth, the sanctuary's director, often marveled at the teenager's commitment. "You have a gift, Ella," she would say. "Not everyone can connect with animals the way you do." For Ella, the sanctuary was more than just a place to volunteer, it was her refuge. At school, she often felt out of place, her classmates more interested in parties and social media than in the causes she cared about. But at the sanctuary, she felt like she belonged. Here, her passion and empathy were assets, not quirks. It was a crisp autumn morning when Ella overheard the conversation that would change everything. She was in the staff break room, refilling a bucket with fresh water when she heard Ruth's voice, low and somber. "We can't keep him like this, James," Ruth said, speaking to the sanctuary's veterinarian. "Kodiak's in constant pain. The infections aren't going away, and he's barely eating. It's not fair to let him suffer." Ella froze, the bucket slipping from her hands and clattering to the floor. Water splashed everywhere, but she didn't notice. "You're saying we should?" James hesitated, his voice tinged with sadness. Ruth nodded. "It might be time to consider euthanasia. I hate it, but we don't have the resources to give him the care he needs. Keeping him alive like this, it feels cruel." Ella's heart raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Euthanize Kodiak? The thought was unbearable. She had known he was sick, but she hadn't realized things had gotten this bad. After the staff meeting ended, Ella confronted Ruth. "You can't do this," she pleaded, her voice shaking. "Kodiak's not just some animal, he's a survivor. He deserves a chance." Ruth looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and regret. "Ella, I know how much you care about him. We all do. But this isn't about what we want, it's about what's best for him. We can't let him suffer." Ella felt tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to argue, to scream that there had to be another way. But she knew Ruth wasn't the enemy. The sanctuary was barely staying afloat as it was. They didn't have the money for expensive treatments or specialized care. Over the next few days, Ella couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. Every time she passed Kodiak's enclosure, her heart broke a little more. He lay there, his massive body heaving with shallow breaths, his eyes dull and unfocused. She wanted to do something, anything, to help him, but she didn't know how. Late one night, as Ella sat at her desk, surrounded by biology textbooks and veterinary guides, an idea began to form in her mind. It was risky and probably foolish, but she couldn't just sit by and do nothing. If the sanctuary couldn't afford to save Kodiak, then she would find a way to do it herself. With a determined gleam in her eye, Ella set her plan into motion. She didn't know if it would work, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to give up on Kodiak without a fight. They believed there was no hope for Kodiak, that his suffering had gone on too long. But Ella didn't agree. She had spent hours watching the grizzly, studying his movements and meeting his gaze. In his deep brown eyes, she saw something no one else seemed to notice: a quiet plea, a flicker of will to keep going. She knew what she was about to do was against every rule the sanctuary had. The staff had drilled it into her: never enter an animal's enclosure alone, especially one housing a predator as powerful as a grizzly bear. But this wasn't just any bear. To Ella, Kodiak had become more than just another resident of the sanctuary. He was a symbol of resilience, a creature who had endured unimaginable pain and loss but still carried himself with quiet dignity. The gate to his enclosure loomed before her, the latch cold and unyielding in her hand. She hesitated for a moment, a voice in the back of her mind warning her to turn back. But the image of Kodiak lying alone and in pain spurred her on. She carefully slid the latch open, the sound piercing the silence, and stepped inside. The air inside the enclosure felt different, heavier somehow. The faint scent of earth and damp fur mixed with the cool night breeze. Ella moved slowly, her footsteps careful and deliberate on the soft ground. She could see Kodiak lying beneath the old oak tree, his massive form illuminated by the pale glow of the moon. His body seemed smaller than usual, weighed down by exhaustion and illness. Ella's heart ached at the sight of him. The wound on his leg, a cruel reminder of the poacher's trap that had almost ended his life, was still raw and angry despite weeks of treatment. He barely moved anymore, his breaths labored and shallow. She had seen him like this many times, but tonight, knowing what the staff planned for him, it felt unbearable. As she approached, Kodiak stirred slightly, his ears twitching at the sound of her movements. His eyes opened, and for a moment their gazes met. Ella froze, her breath catching in her throat. There it was again, that flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't fear or anger, but a quiet, desperate hope. She knelt a few feet away, her hands trembling. The enormity of what she was doing hit her all at once, but she pushed the fear aside. Kodiak shifted again, letting out a low, guttural sound that resonated deep in her chest. His massive head rested against the ground, his eyes still locked on hers. Ella inched closer, her movements slow and deliberate. She knew she was taking an incredible risk. A bear as large as Kodiak could kill her with a single swipe of his paw. But she didn't feel afraid. She felt a strange sense of calm, as if some unseen force was guiding her actions. She finally stopped just a few feet away from him, close enough to see the rise and fall of his chest, the scars that marred his thick fur, and the faint tremor in his limbs. The sight made her heart ache even more. Gently, she extended her hand toward him, her fingers trembling slightly in the cold night air. For a moment, nothing happened. Kodiak lay still, his eyes half closed. Then, to Ella's astonishment, he shifted slightly, his massive paw moving ever so slightly toward her. Her hand hovered above it for a moment, her mind racing. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, the rough texture of his fur just inches away. Finally, she lowered her hand and placed it gently on his paw. The sensation was overwhelming, the sheer size and power of it, the coarse fur beneath her fingers, the faint heat emanating from his body. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she sat there, her hand resting on his paw, and closed her eyes. Kodiak let out another sound, a deep rumble that vibrated through the ground beneath her. It wasn't a growl or a warning, but something softer, almost like a sigh of relief. His muscles relaxed slightly, and for the first time in weeks, he seemed at peace. Time seemed to stand still as Ella sat there, her hand resting on Kodiak's paw. The world around them faded away, and all that remained was the connection between them. In that moment, she knew she had made the right decision. Kodiak wasn't ready to give up, and neither was she. Eventually, the cold night air began to seep into her skin, and she knew she had to leave. Carefully, she withdrew her hand and rose to her feet. Kodiak watched her, his eyes following her movements. There was no fear in them, no aggression, only trust. As she stepped back through the gate and closed it behind her, Ella felt a surge of determination. She had taken a huge risk tonight, but it had paid off in a way she hadn't expected. Kodiak's reaction had shown her that there was still hope, still a chance to save him. She walked away from the enclosure, her mind racing with ideas. This wasn't the end for Kodiak. She wouldn't let it be. So what happened next? The sanctuary meeting room was quiet, save for the faint ticking of a clock on the wall. The board members sat around a long, weathered table, their faces etched with fatigue and concern. At the head of the table, Ruth, the sanctuary's director, shuffled a stack of papers. Ella stood at the far end, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Her heart raced, but she refused to let her nerves betray her. She had to do this, for Kodiak. The discussion began in somber tones as Ruth outlined the sanctuary's challenges. Resources were stretched thin, the costs of veterinary care were rising, and Kodiak's condition had only worsened despite their efforts. It was a bleak situation, one that had led to the inevitable conclusion being presented to the board. Euthanasia was the only humane option. Ella could feel the lump in her throat grow larger as the conversation went on. They spoke clinically, logically, as if Kodiak were just another line item in their budget. She couldn't stay silent any longer. When Ruth opened the floor for final comments, Ella stepped forward. Her voice was steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She laid out her case, recounting the small but meaningful signs of life she had seen in Kodiak. How he had responded to her presence, how he was still eating, still trying to move. Despite his injuries, her passion was undeniable. She argued that euthanasia wasn't the only option, there were other approaches, ones that hadn't been considered. She described the holistic therapy she had researched, including treatments involving herbal remedies, massage techniques to relieve pain, and even sensory enrichment to stimulate Kodiak's mind. These weren't traditional veterinary practices, but they were gaining traction in wildlife rehabilitation circles. Ella went on to explain her vision for animal-assisted therapy, a concept she had read about in her studies. By fostering a deeper connection between caregiver and animal, these therapies often brought surprising improvements in an animal's well-being. Kodiak's reaction to her touch and voice had proven that he wasn't beyond hope. The room remained silent as she spoke, the board members exchanging uncertain glances. Ella could feel the weight of their skepticism pressing down on her, but she pushed forward. She concluded her plea with a simple but heartfelt statement: they had nothing to lose by trying. Kodiak was already in critical condition. If they could offer him even a few more months of peace and dignity, wouldn't it be worth it? As soon as she finished, the murmurs began. Carl, one of the senior board members, was the first to speak. His tone was dismissive, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. He pointed out the sanctuary's financial struggles, questioning how they could justify pouring limited resources into an untested and unconventional treatment plan. Other members nodded in agreement, echoing concerns about the risks and the potential for failure. Ella felt her stomach sink. She had expected resistance, but the sheer wall of doubt was disheartening. Still, she stood her ground, countering their objections with facts and examples from her research. She reminded them of Kodiak's resilience, of the sanctuary's mission to protect and rehabilitate animals like him. The debate dragged on, growing more heated with each passing minute. Ruth tried to mediate, her voice calm but firm as she acknowledged the valid points on both sides. Ella felt frustration bubbling inside her, but she refused to let it show. This wasn't just about proving herself right, it was about saving a life. Just when it seemed like her arguments were falling on deaf ears, Dr. James, the sanctuary's lead veterinarian, spoke up. He had been quiet throughout the meeting, his expression unreadable. Now, he leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. Dr. James admitted that Ella's proposal was unconventional, even risky, but he also acknowledged her dedication and the effort she had put into researching alternative treatments. He pointed out that Kodiak's response to Ella's presence was undeniable. The bear had shown signs of trust and engagement that hadn't been there before, and that alone was worth exploring. He argued that the sanctuary had always prided itself on innovation and compassion. If they weren't willing to take a chance on an animal in need, then what was the point of their work? Dr. James's words carried weight, and Ella could see some of the board members beginning to reconsider. After what felt like an eternity, Ruth called for a vote. The room fell silent as each member cast their decision. Ella held her breath, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. When the final tally was announced, her heart leapt with relief. The board had approved her proposal, albeit with conditions. She would have 1 month to implement her treatment plan and show measurable progress. The sanctuary would provide limited resources, and she would need to document every step of the process. If there was no significant improvement by the end of the trial period, they would revisit the decision about Kodiak's future. Ella left the meeting with a mixture of emotions swirling inside her: relief, determination, and a lingering sense of urgency. Fueled by purpose, she began to plan her next steps. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she was ready to fight for Kodiak with everything she had. In the days that followed, Ella threw herself into the task. She outlined a detailed plan, drawing from her research and consulting with Dr. James whenever she needed guidance. She began sourcing herbal remedies, creating enrichment activities, and developing a schedule for her therapy sessions with Kodiak. Despite the doubts of others, Ella remained steadfast. She had seen the spark of life in Kodiak's eyes, and she believed in his ability to heal. With Dr. James's support and the board's cautious approval, she had been given the chance she needed. Now, it was up to her to make it count. Ella stepped into Kodiak's enclosure just as the morning sun began to filter through the trees. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. She had brought with her an assortment of tools: herbal salves for Kodiak's wound, a handmade enrichment toy stuffed with fish, and her notebook to record every detail. Today was the first official day of her treatment plan, and though she was nervous, she was determined to give it her all. Kodiak lay under his usual oak tree, his massive form almost blending with the shadows. He looked tired but not defeated, his dark eyes following her movements as she set down her supplies. Ella approached slowly, speaking softly to let him know she was there. She had learned that her voice seemed to soothe him, and she often hummed or talked to him as she worked. The first step in her plan was addressing his physical pain. She knelt near him, careful to keep her movements steady and deliberate. Kodiak's wound was still raw, a painful reminder of the poacher's trap that had nearly claimed his life. Ella applied the herbal salve she had prepared, a mixture of natural antiseptics and soothing agents. It seemed to be working, but what happened next wasn't what she expected. The day started like any other. Ella entered Kodiak's enclosure with her usual calm, carrying her bag of supplies and a quiet determination to help him heal. The morning air was crisp, the sound of birdsong faint in the distance. Kodiak was lying in his usual spot beneath the oak tree, his massive body stretched out, appearing calm. Ella moved carefully as always, speaking softly as she approached. She had become accustomed to his quiet grumbles of acknowledgement and the way his gaze followed her every move. But something felt off today. Kodiak's eyes, usually heavy with fatigue but gentle, seemed restless. He shifted uncomfortably, his claws scraping the ground, his ears twitching with irritation. Ella paused, observing him closely. His body language told her he was uneasy, though she couldn't immediately tell why. She decided to keep her distance, staying mindful of his boundaries as she began preparing his enrichment activity, a toy stuffed with fish and herbs. Then, suddenly, Kodiak let out a deep, guttural roar that echoed through the enclosure. Ella froze, her heart racing. She had never heard him sound like this before. His massive frame surged upward, and in an instant, he was on his feet, pacing erratically. Ella remained rooted to the spot, her mind racing. She had read about this kind of behavior, stress, frustration, or even lingering pain could trigger such outbursts in animals recovering from trauma. But knowing the cause didn't make it any less terrifying. Kodiak swung his head in her direction, his movements sharp and unpredictable. He let out another roar, this one louder and angrier. Without warning, he charged toward her, his massive paws tearing through the dirt. Ella stumbled backward, her bag falling from her hands as she scrambled to put more distance between them. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Kodiak's size and power were overwhelming, and Ella's mind was consumed by a single thought: she had pushed too far. She had tried to help, but maybe she hadn't fully understood the depth of his pain or frustration. Just as quickly as it began, the charge ended. Kodiak stopped short, his body heaving with labored breaths. He let out a low, rumbling growl, pawed at the ground, and retreated to the far corner of the enclosure. His eyes still held that restless energy, but the immediate danger had passed. Ella stood frozen, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her hands trembled as she slowly backed away, exiting the enclosure without another word. Once outside, she leaned against the gate, her legs feeling like jelly. She had never been so close to danger before, and the reality of what had just happened hit her like a wave. The incident spread quickly among the staff and board members. By the time Ella had composed herself and returned to the main building, the sanctuary was buzzing with concern. Ruth, the director, called an emergency meeting to address what had happened. The board was quick to react, using the outburst as evidence to justify their earlier concerns. They argued that Kodiak's condition made him unpredictable and dangerous, not just to Ella but to anyone working at the sanctuary. Euthanasia was brought up again, this time with even greater urgency. The board insisted that they couldn't risk another incident, especially one that could end in serious injury or worse. Ella listened to their arguments in silence, her stomach churning. She knew they had valid points. Kodiak was a wild animal, and his actions were a reminder of the inherent risks involved in working with him. But she also knew that this single outburst didn't define him. It didn't erase the progress they had made or the bond they had formed. Dr. James spoke up in her defense, reminding the board that Kodiak's behavior was likely a response to pain or stress, not aggression for its own sake. He pointed out that such incidents were not uncommon in rehabilitation cases and that it didn't mean Kodiak was beyond saving. Despite his support, the mood in the room was tense. The board ultimately decided to give Ella one last chance to prove her plan could work. But the warning was clear: another incident like this, and the decision would be final. Ella left the meeting feeling defeated. The weight of the board's judgment hung heavy on her shoulders, and the memory of Kodiak's charge replayed in her mind like a haunting loop. She couldn't shake the image of his restless eyes or the sound of his roar. For the first time, she doubted herself. Maybe she wasn't equipped to handle this. Maybe the board was right. She found herself in the sanctuary's small clinic, where Dr. James was tending to a rescued fox. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening when he saw the strain on her face. Without needing to ask, he knew what was on her mind. Dr. James reassured her, reminding her of the progress Kodiak had made despite the challenges. He pointed out that setbacks were a natural part of any rehabilitation process and that they didn't negate the strides she had taken. He encouraged her to learn from the incident, adjust her approach, and keep going. His words gave her a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that giving up now would mean not only failing Kodiak but also abandoning the principles that had driven her to fight for him in the first place. She couldn't let one setback define the entire journey. Ella spent the next few days reviewing her treatment plan, looking for ways to improve. She researched new methods to address Kodiak's pain and stress, consulted with Dr. James on potential triggers for his outburst, and adjusted her schedule to allow more time for observation and gradual interaction. When she finally returned to Kodiak's enclosure, she felt a mixture of apprehension and determination. She moved slowly, speaking softly to let him know she was there. Kodiak watched her from his usual spot beneath the tree, his eyes calm but wary. Ella took a deep breath and began again, determined to rebuild the trust they had worked so hard to establish. The incident had shaken her, but it had also taught her a valuable lesson about resilience, both hers and Kodiak's. They were in this together, and no number of setbacks would make her give up on him. Still, Ella couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was causing Kodiak's erratic behavior. Since his outburst, she had been more cautious, observing him with heightened awareness. It wasn't just the stress of his injury or the challenges of rehabilitation. There was something specific triggering his aggression. She began documenting every detail of his day, his mood changes, his responses to her presence, and how he behaved around others. Most of the time, Kodiak was calm when Ella worked with him. However, there was a pattern she couldn't ignore. His demeanor shifted dramatically when one particular staff member, Liam, entered his enclosure. Liam was one of the newer hires, responsible for basic care tasks like feeding and cleaning. While he seemed friendly on the surface, Ella had noticed subtle signs of impatience in his work. He often rushed through his tasks and didn't handle the animals with the same level of care as others. She began paying closer attention when Liam was near Kodiak and saw a clear difference. The bear would grow tense, his muscles stiffening, and his usual low grumbles turning into sharp growls. One afternoon, Ella lingered near the enclosure while Liam was cleaning Kodiak's feeding area. She stayed out of sight but kept a careful watch. As Liam approached the area where Kodiak rested, Ella saw him act dismissively. Instead of moving slowly and speaking calmly as most staff were trained to do, he clanged his tools loudly and walked with heavy, fast steps. Kodiak immediately grew agitated, pacing and huffing. What happened next confirmed Ella's suspicions. Liam crouched to clean near Kodiak's injury, but instead of being gentle, he yanked on a mat that had been placed to cushion the bear's sore side. Kodiak flinched, letting out a pained growl, but Liam didn't stop to soothe him. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and continued working roughly. Ella's blood boiled. It wasn't just carelessness. Liam's lack of compassion and sensitivity was exacerbating Kodiak's pain and stress. She realized that this behavior likely wasn't a one-time occurrence and could have been happening for weeks, contributing to Kodiak's mistrust and recent aggression. She decided she couldn't let this go unnoticed. That evening, she approached Dr. James, her frustration evident. She explained what she had seen and her growing concerns about Liam's attitude toward Kodiak. Dr. James listened carefully, his expression growing more serious as she described the incident. Dr. James agreed that this was a serious issue. They decided to review security footage from the enclosure to gather more evidence before bringing it to the sanctuary board. Sure enough, the recording showed multiple instances of Liam being rough with Kodiak's wound treatment and failing to follow the sanctuary's protocols for handling stressed animals. Armed with the evidence, Ella and Dr. James called for a meeting with the board. Ella's heart pounded as she stood before them, but her determination outweighed her nerves. She described her observations and presented the footage, making it clear that Liam's negligence had directly contributed to Kodiak's heightened aggression and mistrust. The board members watched the footage in silence. Their expressions ranged from disbelief to anger. When the video ended, Ruth, the sanctuary's director, turned to Ella and Dr. James, her tone sharp. She acknowledged the severity of the situation but questioned why it hadn't been brought to her attention sooner. Ella explained that she had only recently noticed the pattern and wanted to confirm her suspicions before making any accusations. The confrontation reached its peak when Liam was called into the meeting. He tried to defend himself, claiming that Kodiak was unpredictable and that he had done his best under difficult circumstances. But the evidence was irrefutable. Ruth reprimanded him for his behavior, emphasizing that the sanctuary's mission was rooted in compassion and care. Liam was removed from his duties with Kodiak and reassigned to administrative tasks while his position was under review. Ella felt a mix of relief and vindication, but the meeting wasn't over. The board members, still wary of Kodiak's potential danger, debated whether this revelation truly justified continuing Ella's treatment plan. Some argued that while Liam's actions were unacceptable, Kodiak's outburst had proven that the bear remained a safety risk. Dr. James stepped in to advocate for Ella, pointing out that Kodiak's aggression had been a direct response to pain and mistreatment. He emphasized that with Liam removed from the equation and Ella's continued dedication, there was a genuine chance for Kodiak to recover. After a lengthy discussion, the board made their decision. They would allow Ella to continue her work but with even stricter oversight. Ruth instructed her to provide weekly progress reports and to collaborate more closely with the veterinary team to ensure Kodiak's health and safety. As the meeting ended, Ella felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had faced the board's scrutiny and uncovered the root cause of Kodiak's recent struggles. More importantly, she had earned the chance to keep fighting for him. Over the next few days, Ella noticed a gradual change in Kodiak. Without Liam's presence, the bear seemed calmer and more receptive during their sessions. She took extra care to rebuild his trust, using gentle touches and soft words to reassure him. Each small improvement, whether it was a moment of stillness as she applied his salve or the way his growl softened when she approached, was a victory in her eyes. Ella knew the road ahead was still uncertain, but she felt more determined than ever to give Kodiak the care and respect he deserved. Together, they were proving that even in the face of adversity, compassion and perseverance could make all the difference. Ella returned to Kodiak's enclosure with a renewed sense of hope. The removal of Liam had already made a noticeable difference in Kodiak's demeanor, and she was determined to find more ways to support his healing process. Her time with him had taught her that trust wasn't just about physical proximity, it was about emotional connection. Kodiak needed to feel safe, understood, and cared for in every interaction. One afternoon, as she sat near Kodiak's favorite tree, she noticed how his breathing slowed whenever she spoke softly. It reminded her of something from her childhood, when her therapy dog, Max, would lie beside her as she hummed lullabies. The memory gave her an idea. Ella brought a small portable speaker to the sanctuary the next day. She had curated a playlist of soft, calming music, hoping it might help Kodiak relax. With the speaker playing low, soothing melodies, she sat on the other side of the enclosure, observing Kodiak's reaction. At first, he seemed indifferent, his massive body sprawled out as usual. But as the music continued, she noticed subtle changes. His ears twitched less, his muscles relaxed, and his eyes, which often looked guarded, seemed softer. Encouraged by this small success, Ella decided to incorporate aromatherapy into their sessions. She researched essential oils that were safe for animals and settled on a blend of lavender and chamomile. She infused the scents into small cloth sachets, which she placed near Kodiak's resting areas. Over the next few days, she watched as the combination of music and aromatherapy had a profound effect on him. He seemed calmer during her visits, even leaning his massive head closer to her, as if seeking comfort. Ella's bond with Kodiak deepened, but her relationship with her father remained strained. He had always been skeptical of her passion for animal welfare, especially given his own history as a former hunter. Their arguments had grown more frequent since she started spending so much time at the sanctuary, and Ella often felt that he simply didn't understand her. One evening, after a particularly tense conversation at dinner, her father approached her as she sat alone in her room. His face, usually stern, was softened by an unfamiliar vulnerability. He sat down beside her, hesitating before he spoke. He began by sharing something Ella hadn't known about his past. As a younger man, he had been an avid hunter, viewing it as a way to connect with nature and provide for his family. But there had been one moment that changed everything for him, a hunt where he had wounded an animal but failed to deliver a clean kill. He had spent hours tracking it, haunted by the animal's pain and his role in it. Her father admitted that the guilt from that day had stayed with him, making him question his choices and his values. He told Ella that seeing her fight for Kodiak had brought those memories flooding back. He confessed that his earlier resistance to her work wasn't because he didn't believe in her but because he was afraid to face his own regrets. Ella listened in silence, her emotions swirling. She had always viewed her father as unyielding, but now she saw the man beneath the surface, the man who carried his own burdens of guilt and self-doubt. For the first time in years, they truly connected. He told her he was proud of her courage and unwavering compassion and that he wanted to support her however he could. The reconciliation was a turning point for both of them. Her father began visiting the sanctuary occasionally, watching from a distance as Ella worked with Kodiak. He even helped her build a new enrichment structure for the bear, using his woodworking skills to create something sturdy and stimulating. Meanwhile, Kodiak continued to make progress. He responded more positively to Ella's presence, often approaching her when she entered the enclosure. The once unthinkable bond between them grew stronger each day. Ella began to notice significant improvements in his mobility, and the wound that had plagued him for so long finally started to heal. One day, as Ella sat beside Kodiak, playing soft music and jotting down notes in her journal, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but she knew she wasn't alone. She had Kodiak, who was teaching her about resilience and trust, and she had her father, who had shown her the power of forgiveness and understanding. In their own ways, both Kodiak and Ella were healing. They had found solace in each other, proving that even the deepest wounds could begin to mend with patience, love, and a little courage. As the months passed, Kodiak's condition gradually improved, marking the beginning of a new chapter in his life, and Ella's as well. Each day, as Ella worked with him, she noticed small but significant changes. He no longer appeared as defeated, his massive form no longer a shadow of its former self. Kodiak's eyes, once dull and filled with pain, began to regain a spark, a flicker of the wild spirit he had once known. Ella had always believed in the bear's strength, but now, with every passing day, she began to see it firsthand. His mobility improved as well. The stiffness in his limbs that had once kept him from moving freely started to dissipate. Kodiak was walking longer distances without wincing, his gait becoming more fluid and natural. The therapeutic combination of gentle exercise, proper wound care, aromatherapy, and the calming influence of music had worked wonders. With Kodiak's physical health improving, Ella turned her attention to his mental state. She knew that Kodiak was not only physically injured but also emotionally scarred. The poacher's trap had not only caused deep wounds but had also left emotional trauma that contributed to his aggressive outbursts. Slowly but surely, Kodiak began to trust again. Ella decided to begin training Kodiak not just for his physical recovery but also to further strengthen their bond. She started with simple commands, using food rewards to encourage him. Kodiak was intelligent, more than she had anticipated. Within weeks, he began responding to commands such as sit and stay, his massive body obeying her gentle cues. She marveled at his ability to follow instructions, his mind sharp despite the hardships he had faced. Ella continued to push Kodiak's limits, carefully expanding the training to more complex tasks. Over time, Kodiak learned to walk alongside her without restraint, a stark contrast to the fearful, aggressive bear he had once been. It was as though his transformation was both physical and emotional, as if he were rediscovering a part of himself that had been lost long ago. Kodiak's trust in Ella deepened with each training session, and Ella felt her heart swell with pride each time he responded to her. She could see it in his eyes, he was no longer just surviving, he was living again. As Kodiak's transformation continued, Ella began to see deeper layers of his personality emerge. His gentle nature, once hidden behind years of pain and distrust, began to shine through. He started interacting more willingly with the other animals at the sanctuary, particularly those who had experienced similar hardships. Kodiak no longer showed the same aggression or fear toward the other animals. Instead, he exhibited a protective instinct, especially toward the younger or more vulnerable creatures. His capacity for empathy and gentleness was evident, something Ella had always believed was inside him, waiting to be unlocked. The bond between them grew stronger each day. Ella spent countless hours beside Kodiak, talking to him, observing him, and working with him to deepen their connection. As she worked with him, she noticed how he responded not just to her commands but to her emotions as well. If she was stressed, Kodiak seemed to sense it and would settle near her, his presence comforting in a way that words could never describe. It was a deep, unspoken understanding between them, a connection forged in the midst of hardship. Ella had become so accustomed to Kodiak's progress that she sometimes forgot just how far he had come. It wasn't until she watched a video of his initial days at the sanctuary that the true extent of his transformation hit her. In those first days, Kodiak had been a shell of a bear, broken, terrified, and untrusting. Now, he was a proud and powerful creature, full of vitality and eager to learn. She had given him a chance at life, and he had given her something in return, his trust, his resilience, and a new perspective on life. As Kodiak continued to heal and grow stronger, something incredible began to happen at the sanctuary. Word of his miraculous recovery spread, and before long, the media took notice. A local news outlet ran a feature on the sanctuary's success story, highlighting Ella's dedication to Kodiak's rehabilitation. The segment aired on multiple channels, capturing the attention of animal lovers and nature enthusiasts alike. The story of the young girl who had refused to give up on a dying bear resonated deeply with viewers. The media coverage ignited a spark of hope and compassion, and soon, donations began pouring in from all over the country. The sanctuary, once on the brink of closure due to lack of funding, was suddenly receiving financial support from all corners. It was a lifeline, and for the first time in years, there was hope for the sanctuary's future. Ella's success story didn't just inspire the public, it also sparked a movement in the local community. Inspired by her dedication and the tangible impact she was making, local children began volunteering at the sanctuary. Schools organized trips, and the sanctuary started offering educational programs aimed at teaching kids about wildlife conservation and animal welfare. Ella, who had once been a solitary figure in her mission, now found herself surrounded by a new generation of young animal advocates. She worked with the kids, teaching them about the importance of kindness and patience when caring for animals. Many of them looked up to her as a role model, and her story became a symbol of perseverance. The sanctuary had become a community hub, not just for rescued animals, but for people eager to make a difference. With the new influx of volunteers, the sanctuary began expanding its programs. More animals were brought in, and the facility itself began to improve. Ella's efforts had revived not only Kodiak but also the sanctuary that had once been on the brink of shutting down. She had shown everyone that one person could make a difference, that compassion and dedication could save lives and inspire change. The sanctuary was thriving again, and it was all thanks to the unwavering belief Ella had in the animals and in herself. Ella's journey with Kodiak had transformed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her bond with the bear had opened her eyes to the incredible healing power of compassion, patience, and empathy. As she spent more time at the sanctuary, working with Kodiak and the other animals, she realized that she had found her true calling. She had always been interested in veterinary medicine, but her time with Kodiak solidified her decision to pursue it as a career. Ella saw how much the animals depended on people who were not only knowledgeable but also deeply connected to their well-being. She knew that she wanted to be part of that change, to help animals like Kodiak live better lives, free from pain and fear. Her parents had always encouraged her to pursue her dreams, but her decision to become a veterinarian was more than just a career choice. It was a reflection of who she had become. Her father, especially, had seen the transformation in her. He was proud of her, not just for her dedication to the animals, but for the person she had grown into. The reconciliation they had shared had been a turning point in both their lives, and he now supported her completely in her decision to pursue veterinary school. Ella began researching veterinary programs and speaking with veterinarians at the sanctuary to learn more about what the path to becoming a vet entailed. She spent hours shadowing the sanctuary's head veterinarian, Dr. James, learning not only the technical aspects of animal care but also the importance of compassion in veterinary practice. Dr. James had been a mentor to Ella, guiding her through the process and offering advice on how to navigate her education and career. Ella knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Veterinary school was rigorous, and there were many challenges ahead. But she was more determined than ever to follow her passion. She had found a purpose, one that was rooted in the connection between animals and humans, in the ability to heal and nurture, and in the power of kindness. As she stood beside Kodiak one afternoon, watching him stretch and roam freely in his enclosure, Ella knew that this was just the beginning. Kodiak had changed her life, and in turn, she had changed his. Together, they had proven that even in the darkest of circumstances, there was always hope. Ella had discovered not just a career but a calling, a chance to make a difference in the world, one animal at a time. Kodiak's transformation had been nothing short of miraculous. The bear that had once been a broken shadow of himself had now regained his vitality. His mobility had returned, his health had improved, and most importantly, he had rediscovered his trust in humans. However, as Ella watched him roam around the sanctuary one last time, she knew it was time for the next chapter in Kodiak's life. Ella had been working tirelessly with the sanctuary's board to find the best place for Kodiak, and after much research, it had been decided that he would be relocated to a larger, more suitable sanctuary. This new home would offer Kodiak the freedom to roam, explore, and live in an environment more aligned with his natural instincts. It was the perfect next step for him, a place where he could continue to thrive in his new life. The morning of Kodiak's departure was filled with mixed emotions. The staff and volunteers had gathered in a quiet corner of the sanctuary, their faces filled with pride and sadness. Kodiak's health had improved so much, but this was still a difficult moment. Ella had grown incredibly close to him, and the thought of letting him go brought a lump to her throat. However, she also knew that this was the right decision. As the large transport truck arrived at the gate, Ella stood near Kodiak's enclosure. He approached her slowly, his large brown eyes gazing at her with the kind of understanding that only animals who had been through trauma and healing could possess. Ella reached out, her fingers brushing against his thick fur, and she whispered softly to him. She had seen him at his lowest and had now witnessed his strength. But she also knew that his journey wasn't over, it was just taking a new direction. The sanctuary staff carefully loaded Kodiak into the transport vehicle, and with a final look back at Ella, the bear began his journey to the larger sanctuary. As the truck drove away, Ella felt a mix of sorrow and pride. It wasn't easy to say goodbye, but she understood that Kodiak was ready. He had healed, and now he would be given the freedom he deserved. Though she would miss him deeply, Ella took solace in the knowledge that this was the next step in Kodiak's journey. She had given him the chance to heal, and now he would continue to live the life he had always been meant to lead. Kodiak's story was one of recovery, resilience, and second chances, and Ella had played a vital role in that story. In the months following Kodiak's departure, Ella's life continued to evolve in unexpected ways. The sanctuary had been transformed by the impact of Kodiak's recovery, and Ella had become a symbol of hope. Her dedication to Kodiak and the way she had fought for his survival had inspired countless others. The sanctuary, once on the brink of collapse, had now gained national attention and was flourishing. Ella's role at the sanctuary had grown as well. She had transitioned from being a volunteer to taking on more responsibilities. She worked alongside the staff to develop new programs, educate the public on animal rehabilitation, and mentor the many new volunteers who came to the sanctuary in search of a way to give back. One morning, as the sun filtered through the trees and birds chirped in the distance, Ella stood before a new group of sanctuary volunteers. She had been asked to speak about Kodiak's story, to share his journey as an example of hope and second chances. This was a role she had never expected, but one she had embraced wholeheartedly. Looking out at the eager faces of the volunteers, Ella felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had come a long way since the day she had first stepped into the sanctuary. She had found her purpose, and now she was passing that purpose on to the next generation of animal advocates. Kodiak's story is more than just the story of a bear, Ella began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. It's a story of healing, hope, and the power of second chances. When I first met Kodiak, he was broken, physically, emotionally, and mentally. He had been through so much pain, and for a long time, I didn't know if he would ever heal. But I knew one thing: I couldn't give up on him. Ella paused, looking around at the volunteers. She could see that they were hanging on to her every word, feeling the weight of the story. Kodiak didn't heal in a day. It took time, patience, and a lot of love. But he showed me that when we refuse to give up on something or someone, amazing things can happen. He trusted me, and in turn, I trusted him. And together, we gave him a chance to live the life he was meant to lead. Ella's eyes misted over as she recalled the day Kodiak had left for his new sanctuary. It wasn't easy to say goodbye to him. I had grown so close to Kodiak, and he had become a part of me. But I knew it was the right choice. Kodiak had healed, and he was ready for the next step in his life. And so, I let him go, because sometimes, letting go is the most loving thing we can do for someone. The volunteers sat quietly, absorbing the words that had become a guiding philosophy for Ella. She continued, "And that's why you're all here today. You're here because you believe in second chances. Because you believe that every animal, no matter how broken, deserves a chance to heal and to be loved. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it." Kodiak's story is a reminder of that. As she spoke, Ella could feel the weight of her responsibility and the power of the story she had lived. She had helped one animal heal, but in doing so, she had sparked a movement. Kodiak's recovery had brought the sanctuary back from the brink, and Ella had become a leader, a symbol of compassion, dedication, and the power of hope. As the volunteers left that day, inspired and ready to make a difference, Ella watched them go with a sense of pride. Kodiak's legacy lived on, not just in the sanctuary or in her heart, but in the hearts of those who had been touched by his story. And as she stood there, looking out at the horizon, Ella knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more animals to save, more lives to change. But with the lessons she had learned from Kodiak, lessons of healing, hope, and second chances, Ella was ready to face whatever came next. The sanctuary was more than just a place for animals. It was a place where lives were transformed, where compassion healed, and where second chances were always possible. And in that place Ella had found her calling. It was a new beginning, not just for Kodiak, but for her as well. The moral lesson of this story is that hope, compassion, and persistence can lead to extraordinary transformations, both for animals and people. It teaches that second chances are powerful and that even when things seem hopeless, dedication and love can bring about healing. Kodiak's journey, from being a broken and injured bear to a symbol of resilience, highlights the importance of never giving up, even when faced with difficult circumstances. Similarly, Ella's unwavering belief in Kodiak and her own personal growth emphasize the value of empathy, the healing power of connection, and the impact one individual can have on the world around them. Ultimately, this story reminds us that no matter how tough life gets, it's always worth fighting for a better future, and that sometimes letting go is the most loving and courageous choice. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video on your screen.